I've always thought of Steve Mongo McMichael as a great Bears player that was underappreciated for his NFL career and just how good of a player he was. By others, and frankly by myself a little bit. I loved Mongo as a kid, right? And I'll certainly say he, to me, has lived a Hall of Fame life. He was a member of the '85 Bears, Super Bowl champion. He went on and he was a part of the Four Horsemen in wrestling, and he was in WCW for a number of years. You know, he's a guy that got kicked out of a Cubs game in 2001 for shit-talking Angel Hernandez before singing the seventh inning stretch. Like, it's fantastic stuff. And you forget about just how much of a personality and a character he was. And some of that other stuff, like the wrestling stuff, the Angel Hernandez stuff, can actually overshadow just how damn good of a football player Steve McMichael was. And of course, it's so often the case, life has a way of making you reevaluate things all the time, as it should, and you should. And Mongo's ALS diagnosis in 2021 certainly had that effect, I think, for a number of people. And because it's tragic, right? Tragedy has a way of putting shit in perspective. And it's a good reminder, most importantly, of showing appreciation to people while they're alive, so that way they can, some ways, appreciate it themselves. And, you know, I give full credit here, and I'm going to link you to the article from my good friend Jack Silverstein. Windy City Gridiron is one of the sites he writes for. I fully credit Jack with, like, getting me to reconsider Steve McMichael as being a Canton-worthy, Hall of Fame-worthy player. Because I had always put him in kind of the dustbin of, this was a damn good player, but I don't quite think of him as truly Hall of Fame-worthy. Like, I don't quite go back and think about him in the Samurai Mike, Danimal, Richard Dent type of category, you know what I mean, on that defense. I just never did. But in engaging and talking with Jack quite a bit over the past year plus, like, it caused me to go back and reevaluate how I viewed Steve McMichael's legacy, his impact in his career. He had a good one. I always knew he had a good one. But not every good player should automatically make the Hall of Fame. But damn, the more I went back and looked, I actually found myself saying, you know what? I underappreciated Mongo even more than I thought. When you look at Steve McMichael in his 15 seasons, he technically played 15 seasons in the league from 80 to 94. He started off his first year with the Patriots, of course. His last year, as he proudly claimed, he stole some money from the Green Bay Packers for one more year, and good for him. He was a two-time Pro Bowler at a time where his peers at the time, players, coaches, they voted for that stuff, so it wasn't a fan popularity contest. Like, that was legit earned. He was a two-time All-Pro first team for the AP, two-time All-Pro second team for the AP. He had 3 seasons with 10 or more sacks, and this is, mind you, as a defensive tackle, not as a defensive end, not as an outside linebacker, edge rusher type. This is as an interior defender, even though in the 46 he would line up at different spots. That's true. But he had 3 seasons of 10 or more sacks, 7 seasons of 8 or more sacks, so there is an element of consistency combined with the longevity that's really impressive. That goes beyond just saying, well, he played 15, 20 years and he put up almost 100 sacks. That stat combined, like, not in this case. Had 2 INTs as a defensive tackle, 13 forced fumbles, 17 fumble recoveries, 3 safeties, Super Bowl champion, and also played in 191 consecutive games with the Bears, if you exclude, like, the scab games in 87. When you look at those numbers, though, and you break them down a little bit, you realize even then they don't tell the full story. He only had 2.5 sacks in his first 3 seasons from 1980 to 1982. Take away his first 3 seasons, combined with that last season in 94 with the Packers, he had 90 sacks in 11 years. That number starts to look a lot more impressive. You say, wow, for a defensive tackle in that era, that's pretty damn good. And when you go back and look, relative to his peers in the competition at the time, I assert, and I think my friend Jack would assert, he should have been at least a minimum AP All-Pro second team in 84. It was a year he had 10 sacks, and it was a year that the Bears set the single-season record for most sacks. Dave Butts had 4.5. Doug English had 5. Like, those are the defensive tackles that were first, second team that year, yeah, McMichael was better than them in 84. He should have been All-Pro, AP All-Pro first team in 88. McMichael had 11.5 sacks. Keith Millard had 8. And I know what people are going to say. Well, yeah, he was also playing on the defensive line with Hampton and Dent. Yeah, but McMichael was right in that mix at that time. He was a guy who listened to player testimonies at the time, peer testimonies even from the time and afterwards. They talk about Dent, Hampton, McMichael in some order, and sometimes they would even mention McMichael first or second. And I certainly feel like in 92 he should have been All-Pro first team or second team by the AP. Greg Kraken was AP All-Pro second team with 5.5 sacks. McMichael had 10.5. Yes, the Bears stunk that year in the last year of the Ditka era. But when you look at the All-Pro teams, you could argue that there are some missing. In some of his best seasons, McMichael didn't get the recognition that he deserved. And when you look at team success, the defenses that he was a part of, that he was a key part of, were number 1 in total yards allowed for 3 straight years between 84 and 86. They were number 2 in yards allowed in 87 and 88, 6th in 1990, 4th in 91, and 4th in his last year in Chicago in 93 under a new coach in Wanstead. And you're going to say, well, that's because of the talent around him, except for the fact that Wilbur Marshall was gone after 87. Otis Wilson was gone after 88. Gary Fensick was gone in the mid-80s. So by the time you get to 88 and beyond, you know, Wilbur Marshall and Fensick are already not in the consideration there. Wilson's gone soon afterwards. Hampton was a non-factor in 90 at the tail end of his career and retired after that. And Samurai Mike was gone in 1992. So when you look at 93, it was McMichael, it was Dent, and Donnell Wolford would be your 3 best defensive players on that team. So McMichael was a key foundational piece. And to me, that 46 defense of the Bears defense just in general that time, scheme be damned, it all started with the defensive line. And McMichael was a big part of that. Now, what's interesting is you're going to have people talk about, well, do the Bears really need 4 Hall of Famers from that defense? Do they really need 3 Hall of Famers from that defensive line? I look at the Bucks of the late 90s, early mid-2000s and say, if they could have 4 Hall of Famers, that Bears defense for that time was better in the 80s and early 90s than the Bucks were for their stretch of the late 90s to mid-2000s. They absolutely are a freaking better defensive unit. The numbers back that up. And they won just as many Super Bowls. So if the Bucks of that era can have 4 Hall of Famers and Sapp, Brooks, Lynch, and Barber, then why the hell can't the Bears have 4 from their defense? Now, full transparency. What's interesting to me is how Steve McMichael went from a non-factor in the senior pool of the Hall of Fame selection process to a semifinalist this year, meaning being in the final 12. Total non-factor to final 12 in a year. That doesn't happen by accident, but it is fair to call out it doesn't happen entirely for the right reason. The Hall of Fame process is supposed to strictly go off of on-field performance. And we can't all of a sudden say that McMichael's numbers got that much better as being 20, almost 30 years since he last played in the league. Like, the numbers don't get better. They are what they always have been. Like, we know that this is being driven by other considerations and other factors. The voters are human, and it's impossible to avoid emotion no matter how much they're not supposed to factor that in. It's why Jim Trier will never see Canton. Darren Sharper will never get nominated and get any traction in the process. But it's also why Bryant Young went from being a finalist in 2020 to a semifinalist in 2021 to a selection in 2022 because the San Francisco 49ers PR got on a Zoom call with a bunch of former players that faced off against Brian Young with the voters and used that human element, right? It wasn't just about numbers and stats and that, and this and that. It's also why, in no small part, that Ken Riley is part of the 2023 class because he was a guy that played his entire career with the Bengals, and you know, there was a loyalty that he showed, and it was showed back to him by that organization, by that fan base, and they pushed for him for a number of years. But sometimes a good outcome can arise from a bad process or bad reason. There's no guarantee, let's be clear, that Mongo ever gets back into this position. You have to act as if this is the year, this is the opportunity, this is the best chance, this is the only chance, because it might never happen. And if you say, well, that's being melodramatic, No, you look at Bob Kuechenberg. Bob Kuechenberg in this process last time was in the final 6. He was one of the first 3 along with Randy Gradishar and Sterling Sharp that didn't get chosen, and now he's not even part of the final 12. So you have to act like this is the year. And when you look at Steve McMichael relative to his peers, he holds up remarkably well in terms of some defensive linemen that recently got inducted into Canton. You look at Joe Klecko, spent 12 seasons in the league. You know, the big thing with him being a 4-time Pro Bowler is he is Pro Bowler at 3 different positions. Personally, I think that's a little overrated because it's not like he went from playing defensive tackle to middle linebacker and outside linebacker or something like that. He was playing along different spots on the defensive line, but still a good statistic, a good result, right? But 2-time All-Pro first team, 1-time All-Pro second team, UPI Defensive Player of the Year in 81. He led the league in sacks that year with 20.5, had 10.5 sacks in 1980, 4 seasons of 8 or more sacks, 78 for his career, 9 fumble recoveries. But you look like Klecko had a really strong peak and a few years of real dominance, but kind of leveled off after that a bit. McMichael, to me, arguably, had much more long-term sustained success and productivity in his career. Bryant Young played 14 seasons. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, 1-time All-Pro first team, 3-time All-Pro second team. He was second team All-Decade 1990s. He had 2 seasons of 11 or more sacks, 5 total seasons of 8 or more sacks, 89.5 for his career, 12 forced fumbles, 7 fumble recoveries, 3 safeties, Super Bowl champ. You look at his resume, though, you know, I wasn't huge on Bryant Young getting elected when he did. I thought of him more as a borderline player, kind of frankly like I did Steve McMichael for a long time. But if these guys like Bryant Young and Joe Klecko are worthy of Canton, then I would argue that Steve McMichael has to be too. And if I look at Warren Sapp, somebody that we all associate and don't really have any knocks against being in the Hall of Fame, I certainly do not. He was a guy that was known in the systems that he played in for so many years as being an upfield penetrator, an upfield disruptor, able to get in the backfield, cause opposing quarterbacks hell. He had 96.5 career sacks in 13 years. That's basically McMichael's fucking career. And if you take away the first 3 years of McMichael's career and his last one, he's got 90 sacks in 11 seasons. Man, that stuff really starts to hold up really, really well. And when you look at the other 11 semifinalists that McMichael's going up against this year, Ken Anderson, I do feel belongs, but it's not urgent that he gets in 2024, especially since the Bengals just got a guy in Ken Riley. Anderson could wait. Maxie Bond's a 9-time Pro Bowler. I think he belongs, but there are other linebackers that belong more, such as Randy Gradishar, who, if he had to wait last year in part because Chuck Howley got in, for this year's induction, Gradishar is one of the 7 to 8 best middle linebackers ever. I would put him ahead of Singletary. Yes, I would. Blasphemy from a Bears fan, I know. But he should have been in years, if not decades ago. Maxie Bond can wait. If Gradishar didn't get in last year and the voters put in Klecko and Riley over Gradishar, which is just ridiculous on the surface of it, Bond can wait a year. Roger Craig has positional uniqueness, but I don't view him as top 5 or 6 this go-round. Joe Jacoby's a borderline Hall of Fame guy to me, just like Jim Covert was. He doesn't scream to me that he must be in now, and I certainly would have put in Kuechenberg before I would put in Joe Jacoby. So to me, that's a no. Eddie Medor, he was part of the 1960s All-Decade team. I think he belongs as well. But there are other defensive backs that belong more, such as Albert Lewis, who I think was stupidly stubborn of them to not put in this a few months ago when he was in year 20, his last year of eligibility in the modern pool, because they just had to put in Rondé Barber and couldn't wait a year for Rondé Barber. Now Albert Lewis gums up the works in the freaking senior process, really dumb by the voters, frankly. There's no other way to put it. I'm glad Art Powell, and at least one of those AFL receivers of the past, is getting some flowers. He went from nothing in terms of the process to being in the final 12 this go-round, but I personally don't think he's the best wide receiver not in Canton. That's Sterling Sharp, and then there's probably a couple other guys I might put ahead of Art Powell. Art Powell can wait. And in terms of Otis Taylor, how many of Stram's Chiefs need to be in Canton? He's not the best wide receiver, not in, he can wait. When I look at the top tier of guys that I would look at in comparison to Steve McMichael, I think there's 4 guys. Gradishar, who I've already mentioned. Sterling Sharp, to me, is the best wide receiver not in. He should have been in as a modern candidate. Al Wistert, this is going back in the day. You know, in the World War II and post-World War II era, this is a guy that the senior process should be representing and helping get to light and helping get to Canton. He was arguably one of the 3 best super seniors not in Canton, along with like Lavi Dilweg and Averd Llewellyn. He was a member of the 40s All-Decade team, Centennial finalist a couple of years ago, and then didn't gain any other traction. Like, he's a legit contender here. I've already talked about Albert Lewis, but those are the 4 guys to me. And when you look at the opportunity in the moment, like, Gradishar, I'm sorry, as much as I love Steve McMichael and respect his career, he was not a better player than Randy Gradishar. Gradishar deserves his time. He's waited too long for his flowers. When I look at these other guys, you know, would it really be bad if Sterling Sharp had to wait 1 more year? If Albert Lewis or any of these other guys had to wait 1 more year? It really wouldn't, right? Versus, you know, if you said Randy Gradishar, Al Wister, because you get a super senior in, and then Steve McMichael, that's still a solid job by the senior committee. And there's no guarantee that if something happens to Mongo over the next few months, or something happens in terms of the selectors, the voters, and the senior process, there's nothing to say that McMichael ever gets back to this spot again. And I know you've got Dan Pompei in the room, who's done some really good work, at least depending on if you agree with who he advocated for. I don't. Like, he advocated for Covert. I would have went for Hilberg first. Also had a role in getting Ed Sprinkle into the Hall of Fame. Like, I trust Dan Pompei is going to tell the right story for Steve McMichael. And similar to what I've done here, my friend Jack Silverstein has done in his article, which is fantastic. I can't even do McMichael the full justice of what Jack did in his writings. You know, there is a story to tell here, and the more you tell Steve McMichael's story, the more you start to say, hey, if Joe Klecko and Bryant Young are Hall of Famers, then how can you keep reasonably Mongo out? And I don't think you can. And that's just as a player. Now, I'm talking about some of the human element here, certainly. But I think there's human element as to why Mongo all of a sudden went from not even being a preliminary candidate last year, not even making the round of 25, to now he's in the final 12. If Bears fans want to do something and be productive as we wait for the season, the time to hit the ground and pound for somebody to make the Hall of Fame is now. Go out there and advocate for Steve McMichael. Tweet about this. Piss and moan about this. You're Bears fans. It's what you do well. It's what I do well. Well, my God, for once, let's do something productive with it. Steve Mongo McMichael has lived a Hall of Fame life. It is only fitting that he gets the chance to actually be a Hall of Famer somewhere. And it should be in Canton. The hell with anything else. If other fan bases and other candidates can benefit from the human element, so can Steve McMichael. And you can feel good about that because his resume looks a lot better to his peers than maybe you even ever thought or ever remembered. And it sure would be nice for him to know that he's got that honor while he can still in any way, shape, or form enjoy it, and his family can too. Steve McMichael for the Hall of Fame, FTW. Bear down, bitches. Go make this happen.